She spent 15 years designing the system that kept their billion-dollar contracts alive, until the new VP decided her energy didn't fit the future. No warning, no gratitude, just silence and a cardboard box. But the thing about quiet people, they remember everything. And sometimes they're already building something stronger. If you've ever watched someone steal what you built and call it their vision, this story will feel personal. Stay with me. And if it hits a nerve, subscribe, comment, and tell me where you've seen it happen. The first thing they took wasn't my job. It was my silence. When Evan Mercer, the new VP of Operations, called me into that glass-walled conference room, I already knew what was coming. His smile was the kind that never reached his eyes, rehearsed in front of a mirror that morning. "Jane, we're going in a different direction," he said, like he was reading from a script he barely understood. Behind him, the skyline shimmered in the glass, the city moving on while I stood still. 15 years of building systems that carried this company through recessions, audits, and executive tantrums, and now I was being rebranded as obsolete. He gestured toward the HR rep sitting quietly in the corner, tapping her pen against a stack of forms like a metronome counting down my usefulness. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I just watched the words roll out of his mouth like data from a corrupted file. "Your leadership approach doesn't align with our new culture," he said. The new culture, his favorite phrase, meant style over substance, visibility over competence. I nodded once, the same way I did when servers crashed at 3 a.m. and everyone else panicked. Calm on the surface, calculating underneath. HR slid a paper across the table. Severance details. Company property checklist, the legal language of erasure. I signed where they told me to, my hand steady, my mind already elsewhere. I looked at Evan for the last time, memorizing the smug precision of his tie, the faint tremor in his hand as he handed me my exit packet. He didn't expect stillness. He expected anger or tears, or at least a protest to feed his self-importance. I gave him nothing. "You'll be fine," he said with false reassurance, the kind people use when they think they've won. "You're talented. You'll land somewhere." I smiled, polite and meaningless, because I knew something he didn't. I already had. I left my badge on the table, picked up my bag, and walked out. The hallway was quiet, sterile, humming faintly with recycled air and fluorescent light. Each step felt like data being deleted, access revoked, email archived, memory purged. But underneath that corporate funeral, something steadier was forming. I passed the lobby where the receptionist looked up, eyes wide, unsure if she should say goodbye. I nodded to her instead. Outside, the air felt sharp, real, the kind of air that reminds you your lungs are still yours. I stood there for a second, watching the reflection of the building I'd helped design from its first data model to its global expansion, now just another glass box filled with people who thought they invented progress. A man in a suit brushed past me, phone pressed to his ear, muttering about timelines and deliverables. He didn't see me. They rarely do. But I saw everything. Every pattern, every misstep, every weakness built into their foundation because I was the one who wrote it. I didn't go back. I went in a different direction. When I first joined Helion Freight Systems, we were running analytics from a second-hand server wedged between a vending machine and a coffee maker that sputtered more steam than caffeine. Harold Tran, the founder, was the kind of leader who still believed in slow growth and good data. He hired me because I didn't talk big. I just built systems that worked. Back then, I wasn't chasing titles or credit. I was building something durable, a framework that could scale across markets without collapsing under ego-driven redesigns. Harold called it Jane's backbone, the hidden structure beneath every major logistics deal we landed. For over a decade, that architecture was my fingerprint across the company's success. But fingerprints fade when the wrong hands take over. After Harold retired, the investors wanted flash. Big buzzwords, slick presentations, faster everything. That's when Evan Mercer appeared. He wasn't a builder. He was a talker, a man who used phrases like disruption pipeline and synergy value extraction with a straight face. Harold would have laughed him out of the room. Instead, the board promoted him. And the moment that happened, the culture shifted. My team started shrinking, budgets tightening, and suddenly, the people who once relied on my systems treated me like an outdated manual. I stayed quiet, fixing things behind the scenes, while the new regime posed for interviews. The last straw wasn't my firing, it was realizing how small they thought I was. But arrogance leaves gaps, and I've always been good at spotting gaps. Around that time, a recruiter reached out from a smaller logistics startup called NovaTrans Dynamics. They'd heard my name from a client who knew how many of Helion's innovations had actually come from my whiteboard sketches. I took the call out of courtesy. I stayed on the call because they listened. No slogans, no buzzwords, just people who wanted to solve real problems. Their CEO, Clara Nguyen, asked questions no one at Helion ever had. She wanted to understand the architecture behind my systems, not just the outcomes. For the first time in months, my ideas didn't feel like liabilities. I didn't say yes right away. I spent 2 weeks cleaning out the files I'd built over years, not deleting them, just studying where the rot had set in. By the time I walked into NovaTrans's modest office, a refurbished warehouse, with humming servers and open notebooks instead of marketing screens, I already knew this wasn't a step down, it was an upgrade. Clara offered me a clean slate, total creative freedom, and one clear mandate: build something that makes the giants sweat. I didn't tell her how poetic that sounded, I just nodded and got to work. Helion had forgotten that systems are built on people, not promises. They had stripped away the ones who remembered how things actually ran. I wasn't coming back to prove anything to them. I was building the next version of everything they took for granted. Revenge wasn't the plan. It was just the natural consequence of giving the right tools to the right hands. The first morning I walked into NovaTrans, the air felt different. Raw, unfiltered, almost defiant. There were no polished reception areas or culture boards filled with motivational nonsense, just servers humming, cables snaking across floors, and engineers who looked like they hadn't slept but didn't care because their code worked. That was the kind of place I belonged. My new title was Lead Systems Architect, but titles meant nothing here. What mattered was execution. Clara Nguyen gave me one directive: make our logistics platforms smarter, faster, and impossible to copy. That last part was the one I took personally. I started with the foundation, the routing logic that Helion had twisted for profit margins rather than performance. At Helion, I designed the early adaptive routing modules to respond to variable data, but Evan had forced developers to hard-code predictable paths to simplify the quarterly reports. It looked efficient on paper, but in practice, it created delays and inflated costs. I rebuilt it from scratch. Every line of code was cleaner, leaner, and modular enough to evolve without permission. I didn't hide my work, but I didn't broadcast it either. If someone at Helion ever checked the competition's architecture, they'd recognize the bones, and that's what would terrify them. For 3 months, my team and I worked out of that old warehouse. Whiteboards covered in logistics equations, walls scribbled with paths and probability curves. I slept 4 hours a night, fueled by black coffee and an almost meditative calm. Revenge wasn't fire, it was precision. We rolled out the prototype by the end of the quarter. It wasn't flashy, but it was lethal in its efficiency. NovaTrans's small fleet started outperforming Helion's entire East Coast division. Word spread fast. Clients began whispering that a ghost system was eating Helion's contracts. I didn't correct them, let them wonder. The system didn't just work, it adapted. It learned from every route, recalculated using live data, and predicted choke points before they formed. That was the part Helion had never understood. Machines could think, but only if you taught them humility first. One Friday afternoon, Clara called me into her office. She had that look, the one people get when they've just realized they're holding lightning in a bottle. "Jane," she said quietly, "we just got invited to bid for the National Freight Optimization contract." My pen stopped midair. That contract was Helion's crown jewel. They'd renewed it every 3 years without competition. "You think we can take it?" I asked. Clara smiled. "You tell me. You built what they're still trying to understand." That night, I walked home under streetlights flickering in the drizzle, the kind of cinematic calm that hides a storm underneath. I thought about Evan Mercer and the glossy future he sold in boardrooms. I wondered if he had any idea that the same quiet architect he dismissed was now rewriting his company's obituary line by line. By month 5, NovaTrans was a name on everyone's lips. Clients mentioned us in meetings, not with curiosity, but with caution. We didn't have Helion's size, but we had momentum. And momentum is the one thing you can't buy or fake. Every week I refined the algorithm, tightening the predictive model until it almost anticipated human greed. I added fail-safes, redundancy triggers, adaptive contingency loops, all invisible to the untrained eye but devastating when misused. Helion's press releases bragged about next-gen logistics, but their metrics told the truth. They were slowing down, bleeding contracts, and recycling my old data like it was new gold. The irony wasn't lost on me. Clara didn't ask why I smiled more those days. She knew builders like me don't need recognition. We need results. And somewhere deep down, I already sensed what was coming. The inevitable collision. Because the moment you start outperforming giants, they notice. They always do. And the best part? They never suspect that the ghost haunting their market was someone they once told to stay quiet. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, sealed in digital gold, an official notice from the Department of Transportation announcing the finalist presentations for the National Freight Optimization contract, Helion Freight Systems and NovaTrans Dynamics. 2 names, 1 stage, a contract worth $120 million, and the kind of prestige that could rewrite the industry hierarchy overnight. When Clara forwarded me the email, I didn't smile. I just stared at it, tracing the words with my eyes like coordinates on a map I'd drawn years ago. The battlefield wasn't new. It was familiar ground rebuilt under new rules. We had 2 weeks to prepare. Clara assembled the executive team while I locked myself in the strategy room, surrounded by models, simulations, and every line of code that had brought us here. I didn't think about Evan. I thought about the system he'd buried under vanity metrics, the one he'd ruined trying to make it look pretty for investors. I was about to show him what beauty really looked like. Clean. Architecture, precision, truth in numbers. The day of the pitch, the conference center was a cold monument to bureaucracy. Glass walls, bad coffee, nervous laughter echoing off marble floors. I arrived early, clipboard in hand, laptop charged, dressed in charcoal gray. No frills, no color, just authority in quiet form. Across the room, I saw Helion's delegation enter. Evan led them, suit sharp, expression confident, but forced. He hadn't aged well. There was an edge of exhaustion beneath the charm, a hollowness that only comes when the show starts to eat its star. He spotted me immediately. For a second, confusion flickered across his face, followed by disbelief. He approached like someone crossing a room toward a ghost. "Jane?" he said, tone mixed with condescension and something close to fear. "Didn't expect to see you here." I kept my eyes on the sign-in sheet. "Then you haven't been paying attention," I said quietly. He tried to recover with a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still in data architecture, I see. Small world." I closed the folder in front of me and finally looked at him. "No, Evan, it's a very big world. You just built yours too small." He didn't respond. Someone from his team called his name, and he walked away pretending not to hear the tremor in his own breath. When our turn came to present, Clara introduced our company in 10 calm sentences. No slogans, no theatrics, just results. Then she handed the floor to me. I stepped up to the podium, plugged in the drive, and began. What I showed them wasn't a product. It was a system that thought. Real-time optimization across multimodal routes, adaptive risk flags, fuel efficiency recalibration, redundancy learning, predictive error correction. Every feature was designed to make freight transport not just cheaper, but smarter, cleaner, faster. The board leaned forward. The federal evaluator asked one question. How is your model this accurate with limited data access? I answered simply, because we built it to learn from what others ignore. Clara smiled faintly from her seat. When I finished, the room was quiet. No applause, no chatter, just a long, analytical silence. The kind that means the numbers spoke louder than the words. Then Helion took the floor. Evan started with a confident stride, the same cadence he used in interviews when talking about innovation and legacy. But within minutes, the cracks showed. Their system lagged mid-demo. A screen froze. Someone fumbled with a cable. A junior engineer panicked. Evan tried to smooth it over, but the slides looked familiar, too familiar. I recognized the architecture, the fragments of my old code they'd patched and repainted. I'd built it years ago, and now I was watching it collapse under its own falsified updates. One of the evaluators leaned toward me and whispered, "Didn't you write the early versions of this system?" I met his gaze, steady. "Yes," I said, "but that's not what you're seeing now." 10 minutes later, Helion's demo crashed completely, forcing Evan to ad-lib through promises he couldn't prove. The silence that followed was merciless. He looked toward me again, this time, not as an opponent, but as a realization. The ghost he'd dismissed was standing right there, holding the blueprint he thought he owned. When the results were announced 2 days later, NovaTrans won by unanimous vote. Helion didn't just lose the contract, they lost credibility. Analysts called it a technological regression. I called it justice rendered in data. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post a single thing online. When Clara raised her glass at our quiet team dinner, I simply nodded. The work had spoken. The revenge was clean. Helion's board issued a statement calling the loss a strategic setback, but the investors weren't fooled. Their stock dipped 12% overnight. And Evan? He sent me a one-line email the next morning. "I didn't know you were behind it." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without replying. Some lessons don't need words. They need consequences. The silence after victory has its own sound. It isn't celebration or noise. It's the echo of people realizing too late what they lost. 3 days after the contract was announced, my phone started buzzing with familiar numbers. At first, I let them ring. Then I blocked them. The emails came next, carefully worded apologies, wrapped in corporate language. "We'd like to discuss opportunities for collaboration. The leadership team would love to reconnect." Evan didn't write directly, not yet. He used intermediaries, HR contacts, former colleagues, even a board member who once avoided sitting next to me at meetings because technical talk gives me migraines. They all said the same thing in different tones. "Come back, help us rebuild, name your price." But what they really meant was fix the hole you left when you walked away. I read every message once, then archived them. I'd already learned what happens when you hand your work to people who mistake loyalty for weakness. Still, I won't lie. There was a small, sharp pleasure in watching them squirm. I'd been invisible for years, the quiet constant behind every success they celebrated, and now my absence was their biggest problem. Karma isn't cosmic. It's contractual. It's built into every overlooked clause, every dismissed warning, every ignored architect. One afternoon, Clara stopped by my office holding a printout. "Helion's offering consulting shares," she said, half amused, half disgusted. "They're dangling 7 figures if you come in as an external advisor." I looked at the document. Bold signatures, rushed formatting, desperation leaking from every paragraph. "They're not offering 7 figures," I said. "They're paying 7 figures for an illusion." Clara laughed, tearing the paper in half. So I'll tell them you're busy? I nodded. Tell them I'm silent. That became our inside joke. Silent meant untouchable. Later that week, I saw the press trying to spin the loss. Articles praising Helion's commitment to innovation and evolution through adversity. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. People in our industry already knew what had happened. One blog called it the quiet coup. I preferred balance restored. Evan finally broke his silence with a personal message. No pretense, just exhaustion bleeding through every word. I should have listened. We both know this company was yours as much as Harold's. If there's any chance... I stopped reading there. My cursor hovered over reply for a full minute before I closed the email. Some bridges don't burn. They dissolve, brick by brick, until you can't even remember where they once stood. That night, I updated my LinkedIn profile, not with titles or triumphs, just a line that said, "Building what comes next." Then I switched it to private. Let them wonder. Revenge wasn't about rubbing salt in their wounds. It was about making sure they could still see the scar. Helion had taught me everything about control, structure, and silence. Now I was fluent in all three. When the noise faded, what was left wasn't victory. It was clarity. The kind that strips everything down to truth. Helion kept limping through press cycles and investor calls, pretending the loss was temporary. But I knew the pattern. Companies like that don't die from competition. They die from forgetting who built their bones. I didn't need to chase their downfall. They were already accelerating toward it, powered by arrogance and denial. Meanwhile, NovaTrans kept growing quietly, the way real innovation does, steady, unseen, undeniable. We weren't flashy. We didn't post vision statements or hashtag revolutions. We just delivered results. Clients who once ignored my emails at Helion now called me directly, not because they wanted favors, but because they trusted my design. That trust was worth more than any title they ever dangled in front of me. Some nights I'd drive past Helion's building, those same glass windows glowing over the freeway, and think about the girl I used to be inside them. The one who believed professionalism was armor, that patience alone could outlast politics. She was still there, somewhere, sitting in that old conference room, taking notes while people talked over her. I wish I could tell her that silence isn't submission, it's strategy, that sometimes stepping away is the loudest move you can make. Evan's name still floated through industry chatter, attached to apologies and rebrand attempts. But he was chasing something that no longer existed, relevance built on other people's labor. I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was distance, growth. I realized revenge was never about payback, it was about proof. Proof that being underestimated isn't a curse, it's a shield. Proof that you don't have to destroy them when you can simply surpass them. I didn't destroy Helion, I outgrew it. The company that once defined my career became a footnote in the story of how I learned power isn't loud. It's quiet, calculated, and permanent. The irony is poetic. They fired me to modernize their future, and all I did was build one they could never reach. So when people ask if I ever regret walking away, I tell them the truth. I didn't walk away. I walked forward. It's strange how quiet success feels when you finally stop chasing validation. A year later, I barely recognized the woman staring back from my office window at NovaTrans. My hair was shorter, my tone firmer, my patience measured by purpose, not fear. We'd grown from a startup to a serious contender, our name whispered in the same breath as the old giants. Reporters called me the architect behind the shift, though I never corrected them when they assumed the shift was technical. It wasn't. It was human. We built a company that listened. Clara promoted collaboration over chaos, accountability over applause. Every time I saw a new intern walk in, wide-eyed, anxious, hopeful, I made sure they knew that good work doesn't need permission to matter. We were rebuilding the culture I used to beg for elsewhere. Sometimes, when contracts landed or new cities joined our platform, Clara would nudge me and say, "That's yours, Jane." I'd just nod. Ownership doesn't need noise. One afternoon, during a quiet moment between calls, I found an old flash drive at the bottom of my desk drawer, the last backup from my Helion days. I turned it over in my hand, expecting bitterness, but all I felt was relief. That chapter wasn't a wound anymore. It was a blueprint. Proof that survival isn't luck, it's design. I walked to the balcony overlooking the warehouse floor where teams buzzed over code and client calls, and I realized the story had never been about them losing. It was about me learning how to win without hate. That's the part people misunderstand about revenge. It's not destruction, it's direction. I chose mine carefully. Now, when strangers comment online saying, "This is exactly what happened to me," or "I wish I had that kind of control," I tell them the same thing. You don't need power to start, you just need clarity about what you're building. They took my name off the door, and I built a company where doors stay open. They erased my credit, and I built something that doesn't need applause to survive. Every late night, every quiet moment I swallowed years ago turned into foundation. And if you're listening, yes, I'm talking to you. Don't just get even, get better. Then let the silence speak for you. Looking back, I realized the real revenge wasn't about contracts or recognition. It was about reclaiming the right to my own narrative. For years, I stayed quiet because I thought professionalism meant swallowing disrespect and calling it maturity. But silence without boundaries isn't grace. It's permission for others to misuse it. What I learned is that walking away isn't weakness when you're walking toward purpose. The people who underestimate you will always believe they've won, right up until the day your absence exposes how much they depended on your steadiness. And when that day comes, you won't need to raise your voice. Their collapse will be loud enough. But the truth is, I didn't want their downfall. I wanted my peace back. Revenge was never about destroying them. It was about restoring balance. There's a quiet kind of justice in proving your worth by building something stronger elsewhere. The older I get, the more I see that life doesn't always reward fairness. It rewards clarity. Knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to let silence do the talking is its own power. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. You don't always have to make them understand what they did. Let them live in the absence of what they lost. That's consequence enough. In today's world, where voices shout for attention, there's something radical about building quietly and letting results speak. So if you've been dismissed, replaced, or underestimated, don't waste your time proving them wrong. Spend it proving yourself right. The life you rebuild will be louder than any apology you'll never get. How to get started today. Write down one skill or idea you built that others took for granted. Then decide how to make it yours again. Clean your workspace, your email, or your contacts. Physical clarity brings mental control. Start a project, even a small one, that's fully yours. Ownership heals faster than resentment. Practice quiet confidence. Say less, build more. If this story hit something real for you, comment below and tell me what you're rebuilding. Share this with someone who's ready to move forward, and subscribe for more stories where quiet revenge meets real redemption.